Wysteria, energy, twister.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the Legends of Britany and, in particular, the fairy Legends of Britany. Fairy origins. Two questions which early obtrude themselves in the consideration of Breton fairy lore are all the fays of Britanny malevolent? And if so, whence proceeds this belief that fairy folk are necessarily malign? Example treads upon example to prove that the Breton fairy is seldom beneficent, that he or she is prone to ill nature and spitefulness, not to say fiendish malice on occasion. There appears to be a deep-rooted conviction that the elfish race devotes itself to the annoyance of mankind, practising a species of peculiar irritating trickery, wanton and destruction. Only very rarely is a spirit of friendliness evinced, and then a motive is usually obvious. The friendly fairy invariably as an axe to grind. Two reasons may be advanced to account for this condition of things. First, the fairy folk in which are included house and field spirits may be the traditional remnant of a race of real people, perhaps a prehistoric race, driven into remote parts of the country by strange immigrant conquerors. Perhaps these primitive folk were elfish, dwarfish, and otherwise peculiar in appearance to the superior newcomers, or would, in pride of race, scorn the small, swell the aborigines, and refuse all communion with them. We may be sure that the aborigines, on their part, would feel for their tall, handsome conquerors all the hatred of which a subject race is capable, never approaching them unless under compulsion or necessity, and revenging themselves upon them by every means of annoyance in their power. We may feel certain, too, that the magic of these conquered and discredited folk would be made full use of to plague the, usurpers of the soil, and trickery, as irritating as any elf pranks, would be brought to in case of discomfort of the newcomers. There are, however, several good objections to this view of the origin of fairy idea. First and foremost, the smaller prehistoric aboriginal peoples of Europe themselves possess tales of little folks, little people, of spirits of field and forest, flood and fell. It's unlikely that man was ever without these. Yea, I sang, as now I sing, when the prehistoric spring made the piled Biscayan ice pack split and shove, and the troll, and gnome, and dwerg, and the gods of cliff and berg were about me and beneath me and above. The idea of, animism, the belief that everything has a personality of its own, certainly belonged to the late prehistoric period, for among the articles which fill the graves of Aboriginal peoples for use on the last journey, we find weapons to enable the deceased to drive off the evil spirit which would surround his own after death. Spirits, to early man, are always relatively smaller than himself. He beholds a picture of a little man in his comrade's eyes, and concludes it to be in his soul. Some primitive peoples, indeed, believe that several parts of the body have each their own resident soul. Again, the spirit of the corn or the spirit of the flower, the savage would argue, must in the nature of things be small. We can thus see how the belief in the little folk may have arisen, and how they remain little until a later date. A much more scientific theory of the origin of the belief in fairies is that which sees them in the deities of discredited religion, the gods of an aboriginal people rather than people themselves. Such were obviously the Irish Sihi, the Welsh Ye Mamu, the Mullahs, undoubtedly gods of the Celts. Again, although in many countries, especially in England, the fairies are regarded as small of stature, in Celtic countries the fae proper, as distinct from the brownie and such goblins, is of average mortal height, and this would seem to be the case in Brittany. Whether the Gorics and Corals of Brittany, who seem sufficiently small, are fairies or otherwise, is a moot point. They seem to be more of a field spirit type, or perhaps classed more currently with the gnome race. We thus deal with them in our chapter when we get to sprites and demons and such. It would seem, too, that if there might be ground for the belief that the normal-sized fairy race of Celtic countries had become confounded with the Teutonic idea of elves, Teut elfen, in Germany and England, from which, perhaps, they borrowed their diminutive size. But there are only considerations, not conclusions. Strange as it may seem, folklore has by no means solved the fairy problem, and much remains to be accomplished. Here we can write finis to the study of fairy origins, because we will never know the fairy origins. I mean, maybe when we die we'll know. Maybe our spirit will know. We can have our theories. We can discuss it until the cows come home. English saying. But I'm afraid there's no definite conclusion as to where fairies come from. There are stories upon stories of how they have always been here, because as far back as you can read in history, there is talk of the fairies. However, just because you presume them to be small, they are not all small. They are like us. Each one is different, each to its own. They have their own little gatherings, let's say, of their kind. And there's many different ones. They're not all tiny. They're really not. You'd actually be quite surprised at some, I think. The sizes of them, that is. But, yeah, the origins, who knows? Who knows? I would love to know your theory on the origins of fairy. And also, I don't mean about the story of there being a great war and the fairies being chased off, because that's a well-known story that apparently that happened. I'm interested to know in your, let's say, fantasy ideas of where fairies come from. I always like the fiction side of things, like in our minds we think, oh, they come from this and that, but we'll never know, so we might as well have some fun with it, right? Have some fun with it, why not? If you were to say of an origin where the fairies may have come from, I want you to write in the comments and tell me where you think they came from. You can be as silly as you like. You can be as serious as you like. Idea is, have fun with it though, guys, yeah? Just have some fun with it. It's just for fun. Thank you for listening, and many blessings.
Wysteria. Energy. Twister.